The year was 3052, and the galaxy was at the height of its expansion. Many civilizations, from the smallest planets to the greatest space empires, had come together for a grand event that would change the course of the future. This was the Galactic Union Summit, where representatives from dozens of different species would gather to discuss the future of intergalactic peace, trade, and cooperation. Each species was unique, with their own languages, customs, and ways of life. The venue for this grand event was a massive space station, floating silently in the middle of a distant star system. It was a marvel of engineering, a city in space that buzzed with the sounds of hundreds of alien races. People walked through its corridors in colorful robes, others in suits of sleek metal armor, while some even floated using advanced anti-gravity boots. The station was a place where the richest and most powerful beings in the universe gathered to shape the future. Among the many delegates attending the summit was Zorika, a delegate from the planet Scythia. Zorika was not just any diplomat. She was a representative of one of the most powerful species in the galaxy. The Scythians were a fierce and intelligent race, known for their towering figures, razor-sharp minds, and unmatched strength. Zorika herself was no exception, standing over 7 feet tall with glowing blue skin and eyes that seemed to pierce through anyone she looked at. She was the very image of Scythian power. She had fought in countless battles and won more than any of her peers. To the other species in the galaxy, Scythians were legends, practically invincible. As Zorika walked through the halls of the space station, she felt the gazes of many alien species fall upon her. Some looked at her with awe, while others with fear, but she paid them no mind. To her, such reactions were common. She was used to it. What she wasn't used to, however, was the presence of humans. To her, humans were a strange enigma. Small, fragile, and lacking in advanced technology, they were often underestimated by other races. Despite this, they had somehow managed to make their way into this summit. Zorika couldn't help but wonder why. She had heard the stories of humans before. Some called them survivors, others referred to them as lucky. She had even heard rumors that humans had some hidden strength, but she was skeptical. After all, her species had conquered countless worlds and defeated warriors from the farthest reaches of the galaxy. What could these small, insignificant humans possibly bring to the table? Still, her curiosity was piqued. Zorika made her way to the main hall where the summit's opening ceremony would take place. The hall was filled with representatives from many species, each more colorful and different than the next. Some were humanoid, while others had 4 arms or multiple eyes. It was a spectacle, a true testament to the diversity of life in the universe. At the center of the room stood a human diplomat named John Archer. Zorika had heard his name mentioned in passing, but she had never met him. She had been told that he was the head of the human delegation, chosen for his ability to speak on behalf of his people. She observed him from across the room as he interacted with other delegates. He was nothing special in appearance. Average height, unremarkable features, and dressed in a simple suit. But there was something about the way he held himself that caught her attention. John stood confidently among the alien delegates, his posture straight and eyes sharp. He wasn't speaking loudly, but his words carried weight. Every once in a while, the group of delegates around him would fall silent, as if they were hanging on his every word. Zorika couldn't understand it. How was it that this human, so simple and unassuming in appearance, commanded such attention? As the ceremony began, the speeches were delivered one by one, but Zorika found herself distracted. Her thoughts kept returning to the human diplomat. She watched as he moved through the crowd, speaking with representatives from other species, his smile calm and collected, his words always measured and precise. He didn't seem to be intimidated by anyone, even the most powerful leaders of the galaxy. When it was finally John Archer's turn to speak, Zorika leaned forward in her seat, eager to hear what this human had to say. She had no real expectations. After all, humans were nothing more than a curiosity. What could he possibly offer to the summit? As the room fell quiet, John stood up, his expression calm, his eyes scanning the room. "Fellow delegates," he began, his voice clear and steady. "I stand before you today not as the leader of a mighty empire, but as a representative of a species that has learned to survive against all odds." His words were simple, but there was a sincerity in them that Zorika hadn't expected. She found herself paying closer attention. John continued, speaking of humanity's history, of the many hardships they had faced, the wars, the struggles for survival, and the ultimate triumph of their will to live. His voice was not loud, but every word seemed to resonate with an energy that Zorika hadn't felt from any other delegate. "We are not the strongest species in the galaxy," John said, "but we have something that no other species can match, our will to survive. And that, my friends, is something that has allowed us to endure when others would have fallen." Zorika blinked in surprise. She had heard speeches like this before, but they were always from weaker species, attempting to mask their lack of power with grand words. But there was something different in John's tone. There was a quiet strength in his words that made Zorika's heart race. Was he truly implying that humanity's strength lay in something other than physical might? It was an idea that confused her and intrigued her at the same time. As the speech continued, Zorika found herself caught up in the human diplomat's words. His confidence wasn't based on brute strength, as she had expected. No, it came from something far more powerful, a belief in the human spirit. He spoke of the countless challenges his people had faced, the moments of desperation, and the times they had been on the brink of extinction. Yet, in the face of it all, humanity had endured. Zorika had never experienced anything like it before. She had spent her life surrounded by the powerful, the mighty, and the strong. She was used to being the one everyone looked up to. But here was a human, so small compared to her, and yet his words made her feel something she had never felt before: respect. The speech ended, and the room erupted in applause. Zorika was too stunned to join in. She had heard many speeches in her lifetime, but none had left such an impact on her. As the applause died down, she found herself still thinking about John Archer's words. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was something about him that set him apart from everyone else she had met. As the delegates began to disperse, Zorika found herself looking for him. She couldn't help but wonder if this human was truly as weak as the other species made him out to be. Perhaps there was more to humanity than anyone had realized. Perhaps, she thought, there was something in these humans that made them different. Maybe they weren't the underdogs after all. And so, with a sense of curiosity and intrigue, Zorika set her sights on John Archer, the human diplomat who had just made her rethink everything she thought she knew about his species. After John Archer's speech at the summit, Zorika found herself unable to stop thinking about him. His words had resonated deeply with her, something she hadn't expected. As a Scythian, she had always seen her species as the strongest, the most powerful in the galaxy. Strength, dominance, and intelligence, these were the qualities that Zorika respected. So why, then, had she found herself so moved by a human diplomat with neither great size nor immense power? Zorika couldn't quite explain it. She had been sent to this summit to discuss trade agreements, peace terms, and interspecies cooperation, but she couldn't shake the thought of John. He wasn't like the other diplomats. The others were proud of their technological advancements or their vast military might. But John, he spoke of humanity's resilience, its will to survive against all odds. Zorika had expected to feel superior to him, as she often did with other species, but instead she felt intrigued. She had spent hours in the Grand Hall that night, meeting with delegates from other planets, but her mind kept returning to the human. She tried to focus on the matters at hand, but the quiet voice of John Archer echoed in her thoughts. She knew that she had to understand what made him, and by extension, humans, so different from the other species. As Zorika wandered the space station's vast corridors later that evening, her curiosity led her to the human diplomat again. The summit had ended for the day, and the once bustling hallways had quieted down. Most of the delegates were in their private chambers, discussing the summit's events, but Zorika had an idea. She knew that humans were often unpredictable, even chaotic in their behavior. So when she spotted John standing alone in front of a large window that overlooked the swirling lights of distant stars, she didn't hesitate. She walked toward him, her footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. John didn't seem to notice her at first. He was looking out at the stars, his hands resting on the window frame. Zorika stood silently behind him for a moment, observing him. He wasn't the tallest or the strongest person in the room, but there was something magnetic about him. There was an energy about him that made Zorika pause, a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the air around him. Finally, she cleared her throat, and John turned, his eyes meeting hers. His face lit up with a small but genuine smile, one that seemed to say he had been expecting her. "Ah, Zorika," he said, his voice warm but calm. "It's good to see you again. I was wondering when you would find me." Zorika blinked, surprised by his words. "You knew I was coming?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. John chuckled softly. "Well, after that speech you gave earlier, I figured we'd be talking sooner or later. I've been curious about you too." Zorika raised an eyebrow. Curious about her? She was accustomed to being the one who did the questioning, not the other way around. The Scythian delegation was powerful and respected, and her species was known for their intelligence and strength. Most other races were too intimidated to even ask her anything. Yet here was this human, standing casually and looking at her with interest. "What is it that you're so curious about?" Zorika asked, crossing her arms. She didn't want to seem like she was letting her guard down too easily, but her curiosity had been piqued. John's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Oh, I'm curious about many things, Zorika. But right now, I'm curious about you, about what makes a Scythian tick. We've heard a lot about your people, about your power and your intelligence. But from the way you were listening to my speech, I could tell something else was going on in your mind." Zorika didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to being so transparent. She had always prided herself on her ability to maintain control over her emotions and actions. Yet somehow, John Archer had seen right through her. It was both unsettling and strangely fascinating. "I don't know what you mean," Zorika replied, trying to mask her vulnerability. "Your speech was impressive, but I do not see what it has to do with me, or with my species." John tilted his head, studying her carefully. "You're trying to hide something, Zorika. And I get it. Scythians are proud, and you have every reason to be. But I think there's more to you than just the power and strength your people are known for. I saw something in your eyes today. Maybe a little doubt. Maybe a little wonder." Zorika's heart skipped a beat. She had never been one to show doubt, especially not in front of someone like John. But in that moment, she realized something. He was right. He had seen something in her that she hadn't even recognized in herself. She sighed deeply, the weight of the realization pressing down on her. "Perhaps you are right," she admitted, lowering her gaze. "I have always believed that strength and power are what define us, what makes us respected, feared. But when you spoke of humanity's resilience, something inside me shifted." John didn't say anything at first, letting her words hang in the air. When he spoke, it was with a soft but knowing tone. "Resilience is something we humans take pride in. It's not about being the strongest. It's about standing up again when life knocks us down. And honestly, I think that's something your people could learn from." Zorika's eyes widened. "Learn from humans? How could we possibly learn anything from a species so small?" As Zorika wandered the space station's vast corridors later that evening, her curiosity led her to the human diplomat again. The summit had ended for the day, and the once bustling hallways had quieted down. Most of the delegates were in their private chambers, discussing the summit's events, but Zorika had an idea. She knew that humans were often unpredictable, even chaotic in their behavior. So when she spotted John standing alone in front of a large window that overlooked the swirling lights of distant stars, she didn't hesitate. She walked toward him, her footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. John didn't seem to notice her at first. He was looking out at the stars, his hands resting on the window frame. Zorika stood silently behind him for a moment, observing him. He wasn't the tallest or the strongest person in the room, but there was something magnetic about him. There was an energy about him that made Zorika pause, a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the air around him. Finally, she cleared her throat, and John turned, his eyes meeting hers. His face lit up with a small but genuine smile, one that seemed to say he had been expecting her. "Ah, Zorika," he said, his voice warm but calm. "It's good to see you again. I was wondering when you would find me." Zorika blinked, surprised by his words. "You knew I was coming?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. John chuckled softly. "Well, after that speech you gave earlier, I figured we'd be talking sooner or later. I've been curious about you too." Zorika raised an eyebrow. Curious about her? She was accustomed to being the one who did the questioning, not the other way around. The Scythian delegation was powerful and respected, and her species was known for their intelligence and strength. Most other races were too intimidated to even ask her anything. Yet here was this human, standing casually and looking at her with interest. "What is it that you're so curious about?" Zorika asked, crossing her arms. She didn't want to seem like she was letting her guard down too easily, but her curiosity had been piqued. John's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Oh, I'm curious about many things, Zorika. But right now, I'm curious about you, about what makes a Scythian tick. We've heard a lot about your people, about your power and your intelligence. But from the way you were listening to my speech, I could tell something else was going on in your mind." Zorika didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to being so transparent. She had always prided herself on her ability to maintain control over her emotions and actions. Yet somehow, John Archer had seen right through her. It was both unsettling and strangely fascinating. "I don't know what you mean," Zorika replied, trying to mask her vulnerability. "Your speech was impressive, but I do not see what it has to do with me, or with my species." John tilted his head, studying her carefully. "You're trying to hide something, Zorika. And I get it. Scythians are proud, and you have every reason to be. But I think there's more to you than just the power and strength your people are known for. I saw something in your eyes today. Maybe a little doubt. Maybe a little wonder." Zorika's heart skipped a beat. She had never been one to show doubt, especially not in front of someone like John. But in that moment, she realized something. He was right. He had seen something in her that she hadn't even recognized in herself. She sighed deeply, the weight of the realization pressing down on her. "Perhaps you are right," she admitted, lowering her gaze. "I have always believed that strength and power are what define us, what makes us respected, feared. But when you spoke of humanity's resilience, something inside me shifted." John didn't say anything at first, letting her words hang in the air. When he spoke, it was with a soft but knowing tone. "Resilience is something we humans take pride in. It's not about being the strongest. It's about standing up again when life knocks us down. And honestly, I think that's something your people could learn from." Zorika's eyes widened. "Learn from humans? How could we possibly learn anything from a species so small?" When she finally reached the observation deck, she saw him. John Archer stood alone, gazing out at the stars, just as he had been the night she met him. There was a quiet solitude about him that made Zorika hesitate for a moment. But only for a moment. She was here to have a conversation, and she wasn't going to back down now. "John," she called out, her voice clear but not loud. John turned, a smile appearing on his face as he saw her approach. He didn't seem surprised at all, as though he had been expecting her. "Zorika," he said warmly, stepping forward to greet her. "It's good to see you again. I was wondering when you'd come looking for me." Zorika gave him a small nod, trying to hide the slight unease she felt. She had been the one to seek him out, yet there was a part of her that felt uncertain. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, she began, about humanity's resilience. I want to understand it more. I want to understand you more. John raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Understand me, he repeated, a slight chuckle escaping him. I think you might be getting a little ahead of yourself, Zorica. But I'm all for exploring new ideas, so I'll gladly talk to you. What exactly do you want to understand? Zorica hesitated. She wasn't used to sharing her thoughts so openly, especially not with someone from a species she had once considered beneath her, but something about John made it feel natural. He didn't make her feel small or weak. In fact, he seemed to respect her, and that respect was something she hadn't expected from a human. I want to understand what drives your species, she said. What makes you so different? Why do you fight so hard when the odds are stacked against you? Why do you keep going when it seems like there's no chance of survival? John's expression softened, and he motioned for her to walk with him. I think we're about to have a very interesting conversation, he said, and they began to stroll through the observation deck, the stars sparkling like a sea of endless possibilities above them. As they walked, John explained the essence of humanity's spirit. You see, Zorica, humans aren't the strongest, nor are we the smartest, but we've always had this ability to adapt, to change, and to push forward even when it seems impossible. We've been through wars, destruction, and countless challenges, and yet we keep coming back. I think that's what makes us different. It's not about being invincible. It's about never giving up, no matter how hard things get. Zorica listened intently, her mind racing with questions. She had spent so much time believing that power was the only thing that mattered. The Scythians had conquered worlds, crushed their enemies, and been feared by all. Strength was everything. And yet, here was a human telling her that something as intangible as resilience was more important than brute force. You say your strength comes from perseverance, Zorica said slowly. But what if one day your perseverance isn't enough? What if your will to fight is not enough to overcome the challenges before you? John's gaze became distant for a moment, as if reflecting on something. I guess that's the question, isn't it? What happens when you reach the end of the line? We don't know, but we believe that as long as we're still breathing, there's always a chance to turn things around. And sometimes, that's all we need. Zorica found herself lost in thought. The way John spoke about humanity's persistence, about fighting for the future, no matter the odds, stirred something deep within her. It was a belief she had never truly considered before. To her, power had always been the answer, but John was showing her that there was another way, a way that didn't rely on physical strength, but on mental fortitude and the will to endure. So you believe that your strength lies in your ability to keep going, even when everything is against you? Zorica asked, trying to wrap her mind around the concept. John nodded. Exactly. It's not about avoiding failure. It's about learning from it, growing stronger, and never giving up. We don't always win, but we always keep fighting. Zorica felt a wave of emotion rise within her. She had never considered this before. Her entire life had been built around the idea that strength and power were the only things that mattered. And yet, here was a human who, despite all odds, had shown her something she had never thought possible. He was teaching her that there was strength in vulnerability, that there was power in persistence. I think I understand now, Zorica said quietly, looking out at the stars once more. Your species doesn't need to be the strongest. You just need to keep going. John smiled at her words, a look of approval in his eyes. Exactly. And maybe that's something your people could learn from. You're strong, Zorica. I've seen it for myself. But even the strongest can fall. It's important to remember that there's always more to be gained by getting back up than by staying down. Zorica felt a shiver of realization run down her spine. She was beginning to understand, to see the world through a different lens. The conversation she had begun with John was no longer just an exchange of ideas. It was a journey, one that was leading her down a path she never thought she would take. As they stood together, staring out at the endless expanse of space, Zorika felt a sudden impulse. "John," she said, turning toward him, "I've been thinking. Perhaps we could continue this conversation in a more private setting. I'd like to understand you better. And I believe we both have a lot more to share with each other." John's expression softened, a warm smile forming on his lips. "I think that sounds like a great idea, Zorika. I'd be honored." And with that, Zorika knew she had taken the first step towards something that could change everything. She had come to the summit to discuss the future of the galaxy, but now she found herself on the brink of something far more personal, far more profound. The days that followed Zorika's invitation were filled with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. Zorika had never been one to back down from a challenge, and she wasn't about to start now. But as she spent more time with John Archer, the human diplomat, she started to realize that the challenges she faced with him weren't the ones she was used to. They weren't physical challenges, like the ones she'd faced on countless battlefields. These were mental, emotional, and deeply personal. Zorika had always considered herself strong, far stronger than most of the species in the galaxy. Her people, the Scythians, were known for their physical prowess and military superiority. They conquered planets, built massive empires, and were feared across the galaxy. Strength, power, and dominance were the cornerstones of her society. But John Archer had shown her that there was more to strength than just physical power. There was a strength in the human spirit, in their ability to keep going no matter what obstacles stood in their way. At first, Zorika found herself intrigued by John's resilience, but the more time they spent together, the more she felt something else stirring inside her. She couldn't quite name it, but she knew it was something she had never felt before. Was it admiration, respect, or perhaps something deeper? The uncertainty of her emotions bothered her, but she pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. One evening, after yet another intense round of meetings with delegates from other species, Zorika found herself walking through the corridors of the space station, heading toward the private area where she had invited John to meet her. Her mind was still reeling from the day's discussions, but there was something else, something she couldn't ignore. As she arrived at the door to the private room, she hesitated for a moment. She had been the one to invite John here, and yet she felt a flicker of uncertainty. What was it about him that made her second-guess herself? Zorika had never been uncertain before. She had always known her place, always understood the dynamics of power. But now, standing outside the door, she wasn't sure what to expect. Was this really just about conversation, or was there something more happening between them? Shaking her head, Zorika pushed the door open and stepped inside. John was already there, sitting by a large window overlooking the galaxy. He turned to look at her as she entered, a smile playing at the corner of his lips. "You're late," he teased gently. "I was starting to think you'd changed your mind." Zorika gave him a small smile in return, though her mind was still racing. "I haven't changed my mind, John. I just needed a moment." He nodded as if he understood, and then gestured toward the comfortable seating area across the room. "Please, come sit. We got a lot to talk about, don't we?" Zorika took a deep breath and walked over to the seat opposite him. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into uncharted territory. The human's calm presence was both comforting and unsettling at the same time. As she sat down, she glanced at him, trying to figure out where this was headed. What exactly was this conversation going to be about? And what did it mean for them both? For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of the space station's life support systems. Zorika found herself staring out of the window, her mind still spinning with the emotions and ideas that John had stirred in her. She had been trained to focus on logic and strategy, but now she found herself questioning everything she had once believed. Finally, John broke the silence. "You've been quiet. Is something on your mind?" Zorika turned to face him, her piercing eyes locking onto his. "Yes," she admitted. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about resilience and your species. You make it sound like the human spirit is a kind of power. But I've always believed that true power lies in strength, physical strength. I still struggle to understand how your species can claim to be powerful when you're so small. John leaned forward, his expression serious but not unkind. Zorica, power isn't just about size or strength. If that's all it takes, then the biggest and strongest would always win, right? But that's not the case. There's something more. It's about what you're willing to fight for, what drives you. And it's also about knowing when to push and when to let go. Zorica frowned, trying to make sense of his words. Let go. Let go of what? John's smile was gentle, and his eyes held a wisdom that seemed beyond his years. Sometimes, letting go doesn't mean giving up. It means accepting that there are some battles you can't win, and choosing to fight a different fight. It's about the bigger picture. Zorica was silent for a moment, processing his words. She had never considered that approach before. Scythians were conquerors, not negotiators. Her species took what they wanted with force, and when they didn't get it, they fought harder. But John's perspective was different. He wasn't advocating for weakness or surrender. He was talking about adaptability, about understanding when strength alone wasn't enough. I've never thought about it that way, Zorica admitted quietly. For us, strength is everything. Without it, we are nothing. John's eyes softened as he listened. I get that. I really do. But for us, strength isn't just about power. It's about resilience, about the will to rise again after a fall. Strength comes in many forms. Sometimes, it's not the warrior who wins, but the one who can outlast the storm. Zorica sat back in her chair, her arms crossed, her mind racing. John's words were like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how much of what he said resonated with her. She had always believed that the strongest would always come out on top. But now, she wasn't so sure. Just as Zorica was about to speak again, a sudden vibration from the comm system interrupted them. The station's voice echoed through the room, announcing that there had been a situation in one of the nearby sectors. A ship had been attacked, and there was an immediate need for all available diplomats to assist in negotiations for a ceasefire. Zorica felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the kind of situation she was used to. When there was a conflict, she was quick to act. She was a seasoned diplomat, trained to handle high-pressure situations. And now, it seemed she was being called upon to help resolve a crisis. This was her moment to prove that strength still mattered. I have to go, Zorica said, standing up quickly. There's been an attack. I need to help with the negotiations. John also stood, his expression serious. I understand. But remember what I said, Zorica. It's not just about power. It's about finding a way to solve things without further escalation. Zorica nodded, her mind already shifting into diplomat mode. She was used to stepping into action without hesitation, without emotion. But as she turned to leave, she couldn't help but feel the weight of John's words. His challenge had stirred something in her, a challenge that went beyond this immediate crisis. I'll remember, she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. But I'll also do what's necessary. I can't let anything stand in the way of peace. With that, she turned and walked out of the room, her thoughts swirling. This was her challenge now. It wasn't just about the upcoming negotiations. It was about something deeper, something she wasn't quite ready to face. But she would. Because now, more than ever, she understood what John meant. The challenge wasn't just the external conflict. It was the internal one too. The space station hummed quietly as Zorica made her way down the narrow corridors toward the emergency briefing room. Her mind raced with thoughts of the situation at hand. The attack on the nearby sector had escalated quickly, and now the station was in a state of high alert. Zorica's thoughts were a whirlwind of calculations, strategies, and possible outcomes, each scenario more intense than the last. She had spent years honing her skills in diplomacy, always navigating high-stakes negotiations with grace and precision. But this was different. Zorika had been in countless meetings before, negotiating trade deals, brokering peace agreements, and handling delicate matters between planets. She was used to conflict, but she had never faced a crisis like this. The situation was far more volatile than she had anticipated, and with each passing minute, the pressure mounted. Her Scythian instincts told her to take charge, to command the room, to fight if necessary. But another part of her, the part that had begun to shift ever since her encounter with John, questioned her approach. As she stepped into the briefing room, she was greeted by a tense group of delegates from various species. They all looked to her for answers, waiting for the seasoned diplomat to take the lead. Zorika had built her reputation on decisiveness, but this time there was hesitation in her heart. She stood at the front of the room, staring out at the holomap that displayed the chaotic situation in the neighboring sector. The map showed multiple ships engaged in fierce combat, and the flashing lights on the screen painted a grim picture. It was clear they were on the brink of war. The other delegates were speaking in low, urgent tones, offering their advice and suggestions. Zorika listened, but her mind was far away. She thought of the conversation she'd had with John Archer just hours ago. His words kept echoing in her head. Strength isn't just about power. It's about finding a way to solve things without further escalation. Zorika had always believed that power was the answer, that the strong should always prevail. The Scythians had conquered and crushed their enemies with force. They had never backed down. But as she stood there in the briefing room, she felt something stir within her. Was it possible? Could there be another way? Was there truly a path to peace that didn't involve war? She had never doubted the Scythian way before, but now, for the first time, Zorika wasn't so sure. The room fell silent as Zorika cleared her throat, preparing to speak. Her reputation as a fierce and capable diplomat was well known, and everyone was waiting for her to take command. She had been in high-stakes negotiations before, but this time, the stakes felt different. The lives of thousands of innocent beings were at risk, and the weight of that responsibility felt heavier than ever. "We need to act quickly," Zorika said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "The situation is worsening by the minute. We cannot allow this conflict to escalate further." One of the delegates, a gruff-looking Tethrian with a deep voice, spoke up. "And how do you propose we stop this, Zorika? The enemy has already struck. Their forces are well armed and ready for a fight. We can't talk our way out of this." Zorika turned to face him, her piercing eyes locking onto his. "I understand your concern, but fighting will only lead to more destruction. We need to find a way to open a dialogue, to cool tensions before this spirals into an all-out war." Another delegate, a member of the peaceful Illyrian species, nodded in agreement. "Zorika is right. We cannot allow ourselves to become consumed by violence. There must be another way." The Tethrian delegate snorted, shaking his head. "You've always been idealistic, Illyrian, but you're forgetting that we're dealing with an enemy that won't negotiate. They'll only respect force." Zorika felt her heart race. This was the challenge she feared, the debate between diplomacy and force, the clash of ideologies. She had always been on the side of strength, of power. But now, as she looked around the room at the worried faces of her fellow delegates, she couldn't help but think of John's words. It's not just about power. It's about finding a way to solve things without further escalation.